Welcome to Leadcast. Today I talked to Elaine Cross. She's a project director in the Ministry of Environment. I think that's right. And I talked to her about a bunch of different things, including what she was doing in South Korea for a number of years.
Currently, I'm working as the project director for CleanBC. If you're not familiar with CleanBC, it's our provincial plan to reach our 2030 climate targets. So it outlines commitments on behalf of British Columbia to actually meet our Paris targets. And it is also, by the by, probably the most ambitious climate plan in North America. So it's a pretty fun thing to be involved with.
And so you're the project director for that. That's a pretty big deal.
Yeah.
It's a significant project.
It is. So I overlay, there's 45 different commitments in CleanBC. So each one of those commitments has a lead that is responsible for the details of making sure that that actually goes forward the way that we have committed in the plan. And then my role is really to make sure that that's coordinated and that we're doing tracking and reporting up to executives so that they know what's happening with every part of that project as it goes forward.
Yeah. So obviously, addressing threats to the environment and climate change, all those issues, one of the biggest priorities, I think, for our generation, certainly reflected in the mandates of not just our government, but a lot of governments across North America and Europe as well. For someone like myself I work for the Ministry of Children and Family Development, and I read the news. I'm not a technical expert in the area that you work in. So for myself and for other people that are listening, can you break CleanBC down really simply? I mean, you started to a bit, but yeah, what's it all about?
What's it all about? Well, I would certainly not claim to be a climate expert either. I came into this portfolio a year and a half ago with communications and project management expertise, but I have been very involved in the development of policies that have gone into CleanBC. And broad strokes, I think climate is all about emissions. So I think a lot of people think about climate and think it's everything under the sun that has to do with the environment. It's really about what goes into the air. So the three areas that CleanBC focuses on are transportation, buildings, and industry, because those are the three areas where most of our emissions come from. There's a few other areas as well, but those are the three big ones. And so some of the commitments in CleanBC are and people may have heard about this, is our commitment to only sell zero-emission vehicles by 2040, or reducing the emissions coming from our buildings every year over the space of the next 12, 30, 40 years. With industry, it's trying to really encourage our industries to reduce emissions, providing some of their carbon tax back to fund that, and at the same time is not breaking our economy, because the easiest way to reduce emissions is to have our economy tank, and we don't really want to see that either. So it's really balancing keeping our economy in a good place with actually lowering our emissions.
Yeah. So I want to talk to you about the 2040 target with respect to selling vehicles, and buying vehicles in BC. So how is that going to work? Is there going to be legislation introduced that basically makes it illegal to sell vehicles? That I'm sure it's going to be a graduated thing, but how's it going to work?
Right. So there's a few different policies that play in that arena. We actually have already introduced the ZEV legislation. ZEV is an acronym, because we love those, for zero emission vehicles. So that legislation was introduced and passed last spring, and that's where the target, that 2040 target, comes from. But you're right, it is staged. So 2040, we're going to be at only electric or zero emission vehicles being sold, but there's
in BC.
In BC,
like you will not be able to buy a gasoline powered vehicle in 20 years.
That's correct.
In BC.
That's correct.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That I heard that from a friend who he does carbon finance and is really knowledgeable about climate change stuff, and he actually mentioned that target to me, and I thought that's good, but it also seems like a pretty aggressive target.
Well, two things. So I should have specified that that's for light duty vehicles. So it's not going to be for the heavy truck trailers or that you see. So it's really for the cars and SUVs and pickup trucks that you see on the road around the province. The other piece is that we've actually seen, so the staging that we have on the 100% target is to have 10% new vehicle sales by 2025, and I think it's 40% by 2030. And what we have seen in 2019, since we've started to implement Clean BC policies, is that we're already at 9% of new vehicles being sold in the province in 2019. So we're already almost at our 2025 target in 2019. So we're actually ahead of the game. And I think I'm sure people will have seen there was a survey that was done that I think 1 in 3 people in British Columbia think that their next vehicle is going to be an electric vehicle. So I think there's a lot of will there. And there's also really strong incentives in place right now. So if you purchase a new vehicle that's electric or zero emission, I think with the federal and provincial incentives, you can get up to $8,000 back. So it starts to bring it a little bit more in line with where people in the middle class are actually able to afford one of these zero emission vehicles.
Yeah. And I guess like for me, I don't think it's, I mean, I'm not an expert or anything on any of this really, but my sense is that these incentives are necessary for people to actually start buying these vehicles, because like any new piece of technology, you get people that are the early adopters and that have money to do it and are excited to get, you know, the first plasma TV and spend tens of thousands of dollars on it, right? There are always going to be those people, but a lot of people, even people that may want that new technology, don't have the means or aren't willing to prioritize that large cost. And so I think people that are maybe in the market for a brand new car are starting to consider those electric options. Where I see it being a bit of a problem is for people that are wanting to buy something used or not pay the full price of a new vehicle.
Absolutely.
And so the choice between a used gasoline vehicle for a lot cheaper versus a brand new electric vehicle or even a used one that's significantly more expensive, I think that's a bit of a pain point for in terms of decision. I'm just thinking about myself too, because I don't have a car and I'm driving my bike around and walking to work and stuff. I do like to get out into the trails and go camping and stuff like that. So you know, I hitch rides or I rent a car or whatever. But thinking about buying a vehicle, I'm like, do I want an electric vehicle? Definitely. Am I willing to shell out get locked into those monthly payments at the prices they're at now for the type of vehicle I want? I'm not really. So
well, and I think you're right. The market transformation starts with people who are able to afford the newer technology when it's more expensive, and as more and more people buy those vehicles, the price actually comes down. So as you begin to scale up and get that market saturation, we'll see the price point of electric vehicles being right in line with internal combustion engine vehicles. And the estimates right now is that will happen around 2025 is what people are saying, around, mid 2020s. So it's not that far in the future where we're thinking that there will be price parity between vehicles. And so it won't, I don't drive an electric vehicle either because quite frankly, I don't have $55,000 to spend on a new vehicle. And I have one vehicle that generally is, I bike everywhere for the most part. So it's not an option for my family right now either, but the next vehicle I own will be an electric vehicle. I know that already. And I think more and more people, as the price comes down, we're going to see them all over the roads. And honestly, even in the space of 2019, as our incentives have kicked in, and quite frankly, as Ontario has discontinued their incentives and all of the supply of electric vehicles has flooded into BC, people who've been on the waiting list for these vehicles for months and even years suddenly have them, and the uptick of electric vehicles on the road is noticeable.
Mm-hmm. I've noticed that too. I've noticed it in my neighborhood and around town as well. So, and it seems like it seems to me, again, as an outsider, someone who has worked with policy, but not this policy and not this subject area, it seems like there's a bit of a push-pull thing going on where you're hoping that people are going to be pulled along by the market when prices get to a certain point, parity, like you were saying, with gasoline vehicles and other options. But then there's also that push aspect of the legislation, like we're not just legislation, but the incentives too. The government is intervening to say that this is the direction we're going, and we're going to help it move in this direction, and hopefully it'll take on a life of its. That's just how it seems to me to be unfolding.
Yeah, it's kind of carrot and stick. So the carrot is the incentives, and the stick, for lack of a better term, is the legislation. But really, what that does is provide certainty for the new car dealerships that you have to sell a certain amount of electric vehicles, and there, I mean, that's been a lot of the holdback. So it's been price, but it's also been availability of these electric vehicles. There haven't been a lot of models available, and even if you wanted to buy one, you couldn't test drive it. There were no cars on the lot for you to look at or try out.
You had to get on a list.
You had to get on a list and wait for months. And so the legislations are really trying to increase the availability. So certainty for industry, but also availability for consumers, so that they can actually, that it's a pretty big expense, and so to do that blind without actually having seen what you're buying is a bit of a leap of faith. So I think we're just trying to increase certainty for everyone who wants to move in that direction.
Right. Well, that makes sense to me. What I'm trying to make sense of and haven't made sense of yet is your career, and because you've worked in a bunch of different sectors, a bunch of different ministries, and like you said, you've been doing this project involved with this work for about a year and a half now. So I'm curious about a lot of things, but I'd like to know how you thought your career would turn out earlier on in your career. Like, did you have a vision? What did you think it was going to be like?
If you would have asked me in my early 20s what I wanted to do when I grew up, I would have said, I want to be an English professor. So I'm clearly not, your vision changes as you go through life, and you just never know what opportunities are going to present themselves to you. And it's interesting with the whole, so I studied English literature in university, and went on to do a master's degree in English literature. And I think that taught me two things, because I wanted to do my master's degree overseas, and I ended up studying in the UK, which was very expensive, and I went to Asia to teach and save money so I could afford to go to university in the UK. And so over the space of 3 years, I managed to do that, and I got into school, and I went to do my master's degree, only to find out as I was doing my master's degree that, you know what, I don't think academia is actually for me. So it taught me that I could really achieve big goals over a longer stretch of time, which I don't think I had faith in myself to do that prior. And it also taught me that this career path that I imagined for myself wasn't actually necessarily the best fit for me and my interests and my skills and talents. So, I think staying open and, walking through the doors that are open to you rather than pounding on the ones that are closed is really important as you chart your career path. And certainly I've had all kinds of twists and turns, and I'm not exactly where I expected to be, but I would say my current position is well aligned with my skills and my interests, and I'm pretty happy where I am right now.
Yeah. It's funny that you mentioned, looking for doors that are open rather than pounding on ones that are closed or are closing. That's something I've been trying to do a bit more lately, and over the last few years, because I get so hung up on my idea of this is what I'm going to do, this is what I want to do, and then it doesn't work out, or a project doesn't get off the ground or whatever. And when you are a really motivated person, it's hard to let go of your idea of how something was going to play out.
Right.
But what I found is that if you don't do that, you're wasting a lot of energy that you could be applying to more viable opportunities. But it's a bit of an emotional thing.
Absolutely.
To let go of those.
Well, I think, to do your work well, you have to be emotionally invested in it. And so when you are emotionally invested, then sometimes it's hard to change course. So I don't know if I have advice per se for those out there, but certainly, I mean, I know when I got to the end of my master's degree, I really felt like this is something I've been shooting towards for the biggest part of a decade through my undergraduate and the intervening years. And to be sitting there at a place where I was looking around me, it's like, this is exactly where I envisioned, and this isn't the right place for me. It was a real wake-up call, to be honest.
Do you remember the moment? Was it like one moment, or was it more of a...
It was probably finishing my thesis degree, thesis, which almost killed me. But
so you're sitting in the library, hair is all over the place, and you're just like, God, this is not the dream.
Kill me now.
This is not the dream.
This is not the dream. And, well, I think that I did lose a bit of faith in myself. It's like, can I even vision for myself well enough? And I think I just learned to have different kinds of visions. It's like maybe a little bit less specificity around them. The kind of work that I thought that I'm good at, or the kind of work that brings me joy, rather than a specific job or a specific project or a specific field. So by taking, and it's a great... It's a great thing to be in government where you really can move around to a lot of different portfolios, a lot of different ministries, a lot of different work. And I find, well, for me personally, I'm not a specialist, I'm a generalist. So I have communication skills, and I've got project management skills, and I've got presentation skills and organizational development. So there's skills that can be applied to a myriad of different scenarios and different work. And I think if you want to specialize in an area, you absolutely can in government and go deep, or you can go broad and really experience a whole host of different things. And my philosophy has always been eat up as much as you possibly, you only live once, right? So try everything, experience as much as you can. And I think by cultivating those transferable skills, that's allowed me to do that.
Right. And so I want to back up a little bit and try and get inside your head in terms of what you were thinking when, not what you were thinking, that seems like a rude way to put it, but before you did your master's, you have this idea of, I'm going to be an English professor, right? I'm going to teach English, I'm going to do research, maybe some writing, whatever. Yep. So you do your undergrad in English.
In English.
It seems like a good first step. And then before you went to your master's, you think, okay, well, I want to go to do my master's in the UK, but it's so expensive that I'm going to have to work beforehand.
That, and also just to get a little bit of life experience, because I went straight from high school into university. So it's nice to get out into the world and see a few things.
Yeah, okay. So it wasn't just, because I was going to say...
looking for a bit of adventure.
Yeah. Well, that makes sense to me, because I was like, why didn't you just go to a cheaper place? Those international fees are harsh.
Crazy.
But that makes sense to me. And so you went to, you taught English internationally in South Korea, right?
That's right, yep.
And that must have been a trip.
Yes. It's kind of like spin the globe and pop your finger on a place, and that's where you go. It was really quite random. The only it's maybe a strange way of thinking about things, but I was always a bit of an Anglophile, which is probably why I ended up in England for my master's degree, and very interested in Europe, but didn't really know anything about Asia or Asian countries. And so I thought, I know that there's a huge difference in culture, and if I don't go when I'm young, I'll never go. And so I kind of just thought, I'm going to go somewhere in Asia, and I'm going to spend some time working there. And I literally went to the first place that I got a job offer, which was South Korea. So
Was it a government program or a company?
It was a government program, yeah. So I was teaching in public middle school. I did that for a couple of years and then moved into teaching at universities in South Korea. I taught at a couple of different universities and then ended up at Oxford University Press in South Korea. So worked with them for quite a few years.
Were you mostly in cities or rural? Like, where were the schools?
I started out living and working in Daejeon, which is about an hour and a half south of Seoul. So it in South Korea, that's kind of considered countryside, but it was a city of about 6 million people. So, but it, you know, it's pretty countrified by South Korean standards. I was there for 3 years, and then I was in Jeju, which is what they call the Hawaii of Korea. It's this beautiful island south of the Korean peninsula between Korea and Japan. And, you know, an absolutely lovely, gorgeous place. And then I ended up, for the last few years, living in Seoul.
Was that a small town then? Or small?
Smaller than Daejeon, yeah. It's like a fairly small city. It's mostly a tourist destination for South Koreans and Japanese, to be honest. So it's a really beautiful place, but you know, a little bit more idyllic, rolling countryside than elsewhere in Korea.
Right, and I don't know if this was your experience or not. Obviously, you can tell me in a moment. But I do have a couple of close friends that have done the teaching in Japan thing and other Asian countries as well. I know one program in particular, based on what my friends are telling me, the JET program. They assess people based on their the applicants based on their ability to like survive in a smaller town because there's a really high demand for teachers in smaller, more rural places.
Right.
But it's a fairly isolated experience, and so they kind of suss people out based on, okay, have you traveled a lot before? Do you mind spending a lot of time alone? Do you know any Japanese? Like all these different things, and so they'll pick the more like people that they think are more likely to thrive or do okay in a more rural setting. And I remember one of my close friends was assessed as being one of those people. That a lot of people got placed in the big cities and they had their groups of teachers that spoke English and communities of expats and whatever, right? So it's a bit more accessible. But he got placed in a fishing village of about 1,500 people. And so when he showed up, there was the mayor of the town, city council, like everyone. There was like a parade to celebrate his arrival, and he was on the community newspaper, like the front page, a picture of him and stuff, and it was like a big deal that. And anyway, it sounded like it's kind of a funny story, but there were only 2 people that spoke any English in the town, and I remember him saying that only one of them spoke it conversationally, like the second person that spoke it didn't speak very well. So were you interacting with other teachers that spoke English, and sounds like you were more in like city centers or more
city
larger
center.
places.
Yeah, definitely. Well, it's definitely like a decent sized city where I first ended up in. And keep in mind, this is in the mid 1990s. So in Korea at that time, like think back to the 1988 Olympics, that was really kind of when South Korea entered onto the world stage. And there really hadn't been many foreigners in the country up until that point, like a few Peace Corps, but like really just in Seoul. And in Daejeon, I was the first white person that most of them had ever seen. I remember at one point, so I was teaching in a public middle school, and the program I went over with was the equivalent of the JET program in Japan. So it was placing teachers in public schools across South Korea. And so I was in a school of about 700 kids. I was the only foreign teacher in the school. So, of course, I was the only white person there. And I actually lived across the hall from another Canadian, but she was a Korean Canadian. So, and you know, I didn't see a lot of Caucasian people for the first 6 months I was there. And I remember at one point looking in the mirror and I looked really strange to myself because it's like I had big buggy eyes. I had literally only seen Korean people for months on end, and to see, even to look at myself in the mirror, I looked strange. So yeah, it can definitely be a very isolating experience.
You're like, even to myself, I stand out.
Exactly. And, it's also isolating in terms of just being a visible minority. I have so much more sympathy. I guess I have sympathy for people who are, who are minorities within our culture, because being that person where it's like literally people point at you and like shout things on the street. It would happen multiple times every day, because it was just I was essentially an alien to people there. And just, I remember my students would want to touch me all the time just because my skin was different and my hair was different. So there was just this complete novelty with me as a physical object that I definitely hadn't anticipated before I went. And the nice thing is, like, similar to your friend, as visible minorities, we were celebrated to a certain extent. It was like a novelty in a positive way. So I can't imagine being a visible minority with, in a negative sense.
I was just gonna say, like, it's not an experience that. I mean, if you're a white person and you grow up in a dominantly white society, it's not something you think about a lot, and you might get a taste of that experience if you're, happen to be the only white person in another space, but definitely not the same experience as the minorities who don't have the same privileges, So,
absolutely.
But I see what you mean. It gives you an appreciation in terms of just feeling different and not having a sense of belonging, and not having people who look like you reflected in different areas of the culture where you're maybe used to seeing it or whatever.
Absolutely.
So you finished up teaching in South Korea, and then you went to the UK, and for a year. The master's programs are just a year, right?
Yeah, it's just a year.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. And in that short year, you're like, I don't want to do this. I don't want to be an academic.
Sorry to all the academics out there. I think you do brilliant work, but I just knew it wasn't for me. It was, as I said, I like to go broad, not necessarily. I can go deep as well, but just specializing in one thing always felt quite limiting to me. So, I just knew it wasn't for me. Yeah,
it is a different world. I'm doing my master's of public admin right now. On the evenings and weekends, and. It's strange to be back in school, and the different ways people think and write. I think I'm similar to you in that I really. Well, I won't even assume that, but for me, I think there's a lot of discussion of ideas for their sake, and that's important for the evolution of culture and for the creation of knowledge and stuff. But I get frustrated pretty quickly when I can't apply the knowledge, and so when there's a new idea or a new theory that's going to help solve a concrete problem, I'm like, that's awesome. Let's get into that. But the more theoretical stuff, I have a problem with connecting with. Luckily, the MPA is very applied, even more so than like my undergrad classes were years and years ago, which I'm pleasantly surprised by. It's very much an applied program.
Yeah. So. I think I would concur with that. I found, of course, English literature is a field that's been very vastly studied over the years. And so at this point, or at that point, I suppose, people are getting into very niche areas in order to find new areas of research. And it tends to be very conceptual and very theoretical. So I'm like you. I like concrete ideas. I like finding, give me a complex, thorny, real world problem, and I can tackle it and kind of tease it apart and find ways of pushing it forward. So, and that I know is one of my strong points. conceptual, theoretical ideas and kind of diving into that world it just wasn't my forte. And I think as you grow older, you do get more awareness of yourself and your strengths and what you're capable of. And I think it's always good to push the boundaries of that. But knowing your strengths and knowing the areas where you can really push yourself and succeed in your work and in your life and in what the goals that you set for yourself, I think is important to self-fulfillment.
Yeah, I think so too. And I think that while the skills you can gather when you really apply yourself hard to something specific for an extended amount of time, those skills are valuable. Lots of them can be transferable. I think just the act of doing it and learning how to focus in itself is valuable too. Whatever it is, even if it's like a fine art or a trade or whatever it is, learning that you can work towards something in the future and you can sort through the details on a day-to-day basis and you can maintain focus for that long, even if you switch into a different area. I mean, this is true of you in your career, right? Because you studied English Lit and now you're in the policy and large-scale government projects world. Surely just that ability to know that you can work hard and apply yourself and analyze evidence, even if it's in a totally different field, that's got to be useful.
Absolutely. And I think also knowing, how can I say this? It's not exactly failure, but knowing that things are never going to turn out exactly the way that you think that they will. So I've seen a number of different people or projects try and, dream up a wonderful strategic framework on X and then try and implement that framework. And I've always found a better approach is, know where you're going, know where you're trying to get to in terms of your goal, but then standing from where you are, what's the first most logical step of success? Like, what's your best step towards that goal? You take that step and then you look around you and find out where's the next step. So I think that I have managed to be successful on a number of different projects, and I think I don't start with a grand vision, or I guess I start with a goal, but I don't start with where I've figured out everything that we're going to do and then we're just implementing it. It's really a very iterative approach, and I think that allows for those things that come at you from the sidelines that you never expected, and you're able to incorporate that into your iterations and figure out the next best step. So I think it's a much more versatile and sustainable approach to achieving goals than the strategic framework. I've heard about strategic frameworks for 15 years in government. I have yet to see one get implemented successfully, as people expected it to. Yeah.
So because you're a project director and because I know so little in a lot of ways about I know kind of generally about some project management methodologies, but I'm not trained in any of them. So what's the best way to do it? Agile or waterfall? Can you solve this finally for me and for a lot of people out there?
Well, probably not, because I would say I have project management skills and that I've been able to, as I say, take on projects and actually achieve what we set out to do over some thorny complications. But I'm not a trained project manager either. Like, I don't have my PMP, and I've done a little bit of Agile training. But I think the concept of Agile appeals to me. I think the idea of iteratively co-developing solutions makes a lot of sense to me. I think working with the people who are actually have their hands on in the work of what it is that you're trying to push the needle on is really important, because they'll have the best solutions. Like, I think they're the best informed to be able to help you with figuring out how to do something a little bit differently. So I have I wouldn't
I set you up. I hope you know that.
I wouldn't say I'm a practitioner of either of those methodologies, but I think I have general principles that I follow when I'm doing a project. And the other caveat I would say is CleanBC is my first big government project. And so on other projects that I've done, it's like, yeah, I'm setting out to, figure out how to do succession management in Ministry X. So that's a pretty complicated thing to try and take on because it's like people systems, and there is nothing more complex than people systems. But generally speaking, the scope was, within my team and with key stakeholders, and it was a little bit easier to push forward. With something like CleanBC is the first time really working with, executives across several ministries, working groups that have executive directors from like 10 plus ministries. Like it really is an all of government approach, and it's my first time working in that milieu, and it's been absolutely fascinating. And I would say, the basic principles that I have that I learned through doing projects within different environments absolutely hold true in those big, large projects as well.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think, I'm sorry for setting you up like that.
You'll have to take me for coffee afterwards.
Yeah. I think they're both useful, kind of just to build on what you said. I think they're both useful kind of approaches, and the principles in both, are appropriate for different projects and for different scenarios in the same project. I know on my team, I try to emphasize that we do we try to do the thing of testing it small and then scaling it, like actually show that it works and figure out the bugs before you're going to roll out something huge, especially if it is going to be something huge, because isn't it worth it to make a couple of small investments and rather than anyway, I could go off on that, but also it is important, especially when you're trying to make large scale policy shifts or shifts in culture. You do need to have a vision and an overall kind of direction. So, I think it's kind of an impossible question to answer. So I apologize.
No, not at all. One thing that I would say though, because I'm very iterative in the way I approach my work, generally speaking, and I think that's good as long as your decision makers have to be aware of that. I think there's been the odd time where I've taken something that was like very draft. It's like just to get an idea of, hey, this is the concept. Do you like it or not? And I've had ADMs kind of scratch their head and look at it and kind of go, is this what you're presenting to an ADM? And it's like, yes, but this is early concept because I don't want to do a whole bunch of work on something that...
Because I'm trying not to waste my time and yours.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so I think I've been a bit more explicit with my decision makers from that point forward, just to make sure that they know, like, this is concept. I'm going to be bringing you concepts. It's not going to be even a very good draft. It's really just to get your sense of it. And then we're going to work iteratively on making this perfect over the space of several iterations.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense to me, but I guess when you're dealing with people that are, at a higher level, used to, they're executives and they're used to seeing polished briefing notes and things that are worked on for weeks and months and years and finally land on their desk, and so if they see something that doesn't quite align with what they're expecting, they're just kind of like, is this it? Are you going to go back and do some more work on this? And it's like, yes, I'm just trying to make sure that we're on the same page.
Absolutely. So, and I think they're not used to seeing things that are a little bit more raw. But as you say, it's what a waste to work on something for weeks and even months and then land it on an ADM desk and they say, this isn't what I wanted. This isn't what I expected.
Yeah. And is it your experience that you have to build a bit of trust for that approach to work, or not really? Do you try that? Like, you're brand new in a job and you're like, this is what I'm thinking. What do you think? You right away.
I do.
Yeah.
It's just it's the way my brain works. And so, I think I've tried to polish things. Like, I just find, I don't have ESP. I don't know exactly, like, I try and get expectations clear up front so I know what I'm shooting towards. But, I like having lots of different brains weighing in on what I'm working on because I'm there. I have my blind spots. I have things that I haven't thought of. And so, having other people weigh in and, showing my ADM something. He's a very, very smart person. And he always sees things that it's like, oh, yeah, no, I didn't consider that. And that's a great thing. I'm going to add that in for the next iteration. So I think of it as a vehicle to get lots of ideas and lots of brain power on a problem that I'm working on.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense to me. So I want to continue to kind of work through your career here. So you decided you didn't want to become a illustrious professor, and and then what? So you're in the UK in a library, and then what?
And then I ran back to Korea for a little bit because I didn't know what the heck I was going to do. And that's where I ended up working for Oxford University Press. And I think that's one of those doors that it wasn't even on my radar to even consider that. And a friend phoned me up and said, hey, there's this job that I think you'd be great at. So why don't you apply for it? And I ended up working with that company for for the next several years, and learning a lot about the publishing industry actually,
academic publishing specifically, or no?
Well, Oxford is a really interesting organization because they are nonprofit, but essentially their English language publishing arm is it's a profit arm of the organization that essentially funds all of the non-profitable publishing that they do. And so they do a lot of academic publishing that doesn't necessarily earn them a whole lot of money. And so as much as they're non-profit, it was like working in a for-profit area. So the area I was working in was specifically because it was in South Korea. It was their English language teaching series, which were very popular and very profitable. So, it was essentially my role there was working with teachers to help them adopt Oxford books. So it was a little bit more marketing than I had done previously, but there was a lot of communications work. I basically worked as a presenter for 3 years, and there's nothing like a lot of practice to get pretty good at something. So that was a great experience. And also just working, we had authors from all over the world come to South Korea to do book tours across the country. And so I got to meet a lot of really interesting people. And I think I've seen, I've definitely seen more of South Korea than most people that are living there. I think I've seen on pretty much every corner in every city of that country, because we would do tours every month where we'd either hit all of the major cities or all of the minor cities, just working with teachers and introducing new books to the market. So
right. Peddling English language tools, right? Peddling, that sounds negative. Sorry.
Well, that's what it felt like a little bit. I used to joke that it was kind of like being a Tupperware salesman, but it also got me into working with Oxford University Press in New York, Oxford University Press in the UK. When I first moved back to Canada, I actually, for the first, I think, 2 years I was here, I basically survived on freelance work through Oxford. So as much as there is definitely, I'm not a Tupperware salesperson. I'm not a salesperson at all. I'm probably the worst salesperson in the world. But in terms of teaching people how to teach better, that was a lot of my role, was kind of teacher training and teaching people how to actually use books, because lots of times people are showing up in these markets without any teaching experience whatsoever. So
and I mean, as far as working for a business, it's a product that is helping people learn a language. Like it's not a harmful product. It's not, because there are businesses out there where there are definitely some ethical lines that are crossed in terms of promoting something that isn't necessarily good for people or whatever. But I mean, books and teaching materials, that's not such a bad thing to
sell.
It's
not so bad.
Yeah, it's not. There are worse things to
if you have to sell, it's on the lesser end of the harm.
Yeah, it's a spectrum. That's right. I like that. It's a spectrum. So then you're back in Canada and you do some freelance work. And then what? Were you in? Where were you?
I was in Vancouver.
Okay.
So when my husband and I returned, so I got married when I was in South Korea to a Canadian guy, not a South Korean. So when we came back to Canada, it was a lifestyle choice to live on the West Coast. We kind of thought about Toronto and decided on Vancouver. And so there isn't a whole lot of publishing in Vancouver. I knew I wasn't going to probably continue in that vein. And so it was another one of these moments of, okay, now what?
Did he have something he could do in Vancouver?
Yes. So he has very transferable skills and had a job lined up. So we weren't destitute or anything.
Okay.
But I was kind of at loose ends. And so, yeah, my freelance work gave me a bit of an income, but I was like kind of living in downtown Vancouver, dealing with return culture shock, which is hilarious to come back to Canada because I'd been like most of a decade overseas, and to actually live in Canada again, it's felt weird. Like it took a few months to really settle back into being me in this new environment. And yeah, I applied for a lot of jobs. I think I applied for pretty much anything and everything under the sun because I wanted a full-time job. I didn't want to just do freelance. And because all of my professional experience was overseas, it took a long time. And
did people not really value the overseas experience as much?
I thought that they would value it a lot more, to be honest with you. Like,
really? Yeah.
Cross-cultural experience. I've managed to be successful in numerous environments, but it's like, no, there was like,
Really?
I found it very difficult to get even an interview for admin work, and it was just
Really?
it was quite demoralizing, to be honest with you. But then happened to be shortlisted for this managerial position in government, which is I wasn't even going to apply for it because I thought it was like far beyond what I could ever hope for, and ended up being offered the job. So it was like, whoa, that's crazy. Never thought I'd, work for government. I always kind of thought I'd end up in an arts organization or publishing, something like that. But
between those options and selling Tupperware,
yeah,
one of those, right? Yeah.
Something along those lines.
What was that first job?
It was working as an associate manager for what is now the Ministry of Social Development and Poverty Reduction. And they had at that point a teaching center, or like a learning center in downtown Vancouver. As you can imagine, the roles in that ministry are very specialized, and so they had quite a curriculum of ministry-specific training for employment and assistance workers. And that was one of my first jobs, is to come in and overhaul the EAW core training. So there wasn't really a provincial program for training for EAWs before that time, and that was in 2006. And so over the space of a little over a year, we created a 3-month on-the-job how to be an EAW program, which is still being used today, which is kind of cool.
Really?
Mm-hmm.
Interesting. I know for our ministry, or for the ministry I currently work for, MCFD, there is delegation training to become, if you want to be a child protection social worker or whatever. And even in the time that I've worked for the ministry, less than 10 years, it's changed the way it's delivered. Now there's a big online component.
Yep.
But I heard from my colleagues that I worked with that it used to be like a 6-month program, like years ago, and then it was cut down to 3 months, and then it gets smaller and smaller and smaller.
Mm-hmm.
But your program is still going.
Yep. It's
must be a good one.
It has gone through many, many iterations, and I'm sure there's probably almost nothing left of what I originally put in place in 2006. But the basic,
except the length of time. You picked the right length of time, right? 3 months.
Well, it's kind of funny because EAWs are, I remember at one point they were being called, what was it, the greenhouse position. So it's like, come into government in this position and learn about government, and then you can go on to other things, except for the fact that, it's a really complicated position. It's the skills that you need to be effective in terms of discretionary decision making and client service with a really I don't want to say difficult client base, but just a client base that can be
People
challenging.
that have specialized needs.
Absolutely.
And
then
you need to know policy as well and all of that
and
stuff.
legislation, and so it's quite complicated. And to be honest with you, even though the training program, a lot of it was around mentorship and learning, like experiential learning, which I think still holds true today as being an effective way to learn. But really, most people said, I didn't really feel comfortable in this job until after the first year. So it takes a long time to get up to speed. But yeah, it's gratifying to look back and see that program created at least some consistency across the province and has been, must have done something right because it's still going.
Yeah. And how long were you there?
Oh, I was in that ministry for the first 10 years of my career. So
wait, 2006
to 20, was it 20? Yeah, 2006 to 2016.
Okay. Wow. So, but you worked a couple of different roles there.
Yeah.
So after that, what did you do?
So after associate manager, I became the manager of learning services. So I was actually leading that group for several years, and then I moved into the director of communications and engagement for the ministry. Mm-hmm. And in that role, I was basically overseeing the internal communications group,
for the whole ministry.
The web group.
Yep.
Yeah. And the corporate initiatives group. So, think health and wellness and diversity and so on.
Okay.
So it's a group of about 10 people that worked on those three areas.
Okay. And in terms of like interviewing for jobs and stuff like that, as you move through your career, you've obviously been through a number of different interviews, getting a number of different jobs, and there was obviously a time, you mentioned there was a time in Vancouver when you couldn't even get an interview because the experience you had in South Korea wasn't, worth to employers at least what you felt it was worth, and I would argue what it actually was worth. I've had some bad interviews.
Haven't we
too.
all?
I remember there was one, and I lived in Vancouver for about 10 years as well. I just moved back a little while ago to Victoria. And I remember going to an interview that I was really excited for at a policy think tank in
cool.
Vancouver. And I was like, this is perfect for me. I'm really interested in what this group does. And I won't say which think tank it was, but anyway, so I went to the interview, and it was like way up on the like 17th or 18th floor or something. And I wasn't used to being in these big fancy buildings like downtown Vancouver. So just the fact that it was like that high up in the building, I was like, wow, this is really nice. And so I went up there, and because it's part of my personality, probably also because I was nervous, I tried to make a joke at the outset of the interview. And but I didn't know anyone who was on the panel that was interviewing me. They didn't know my sense of humor, my personality, anything. So I don't even remember what I said, but it was something like, so you guys are really living large up here on the 18th floor. Like, what's it like living up here or working up here? And I was just trying to be like jokey, and the hiring manager was just like, I don't understand what you mean. And I was like, oh, it's just a joke. It's just like a really nice office. You're really high up here. And he's like, yeah, well, we like it. And then the interview started. And I did not get the job. And I was kicking myself on my way home. But have you had any bad interviews? Any bad interview experience?
Of course.
Do you have an example?
Yeah, there's one in particular I'm thinking of where I hadn't interviewed in a while, and I knew that I was kind of gearing up to make a move. So I applied on a few jobs that I was like, that might be interesting. I'm not sure that I totally want that job, but I'll throw my hat in the ring. And so in this one particular job, I got an interview, and I was like, oh crap. And I I did not do as much preparation as I probably should have. Like normally when I'm preparing for an interview, I've got everything organized ahead of time. I know my stories. I do mock interviews with a couple of different people just so that I've got, I'm ready for it, right? I didn't do any of that stuff, so I kind of walked in because I was like, I don't really want this job, but I'll go through the interview because it's like it's good to hone your skills. And I think that was just such a huge mistake because, this is government. It's pretty small, and I know I did not represent myself well, and I've run into the people who are sitting across the table from me on a number of different occasions, and I don't know if they totally remember me, but I feel like they do. So it's like I didn't put my best face forward, and I didn't take it as seriously as I should have, and I think that reflected badly upon myself. And those things stay with people, especially or I think that they do. So yeah, I think my learning from that is always take I'm jokey too, so it's like, anyway, but you have to take things you have to take things seriously and not waste people's time. Like if they have granted you the, I will say, honor of presenting yourself to them, take the time to really do your preparation and put your best self forward.
Yeah, I think that's important. How did you know it was not going well?
Oh, well, I think body language, crossed arms, and I could just tell with a couple of pointed questions. And yeah, I just knew. It's like, oh crap. But then, you're you're in the middle of something and you just have to kind of see it through to the end. So, yeah, no, I mean, it comes from being a presenter. I'm highly attuned to my audience. And so, those cues from the person sitting across from me, it's like and it also kind of flustered me. And so I probably did even worse from that point forward, just knowing that it wasn't playing well. And it's like, oh crap. But, what do you do at that point?
Yeah. Presenting is such an important skill that I didn't really know this until a couple of years ago, but in government and in a lot of other areas too, in business and sales, presenting and pitching is a huge skill, and you can have the best idea in the world, and if you cannot speak clearly, write well, present yourself professionally, you're gonna bomb. And furthermore, you in order to get anywhere, including in interviews or getting your project approved or whatever, you really need to have a tight set of presentation skills, is what I've learned pretty recently. And so I've made it a point to for me, public speaking and presenting and doing Q's and A's, all of those things. But it seems I'm trying to do that more over the next few years and have been doing that. It seems like you honed some of those skills. I remember you saying in South Korea when you were doing that. Were you naturally a good presenter at the start?
Probably not. I would just
average or bad or what?
I mean, I did do a bit of public speaking as a kid, so
you were a teacher too, so you.
Yeah, exactly. So you're in front of classrooms, and I think especially being a presenter to audiences that do not speak your language, and being a teacher to kids that don't speak your language, native speakers tend to ramble and lots of filler. I think it helps you to really crystallize what you're saying, not to add in a lot of extra fluff, and that
because that's not helpful for people that are learning. They're like, what was that?
Yeah, well, they can't even, it's almost stream of consciousness that I think a lot of, when you're speaking with native speakers, you just blah, 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 you just ramble on. And I think speaking in front of people who don't speak your language, you naturally learn to pause, give them a chance to process, to keep up with you, and that works very well for decision makers as well. So, I think the skills that I learned in South Korea being a presenter, and also, I mean, it's horrible and painful, but all of my presentations were videotaped, and part of the expectations for me were that I was to watch those videotapes and self-assess and learn how to become a better presenter. So I did that for 3 years, and it's horrible and painful,
but it really helps.
Very effective. Yes.
Yeah, because you can pick up on things really. This part of this exercise for me has forced me to get over that a little bit in terms of like listening to your voice recorded, because it's very painful. Especially the first few times you do it, you're like, I don't sound like that, do I? Like that's, but you do, and you have to kind of get over that.
Absolutely.
And once you do, you can kind of pick apart what is not working, and you can figure out how to use pauses, and you can figure out how to vary the speed of your voice and the tone of your voice and all these different things. But yeah, that feedback piece, the video or the audio, very painful, but I highly recommend it to anyone that wants to learn how to speak better or present well or whatever, because there's nothing that's going to teach you as fast.
True. There's a really great course that I took fairly recently called Leadership Presence, and part of that, it's a 2-day course, and it is all about how you present. And
in government, if the course
it's offered in government, and part of it is doing a presentation, being videotaped, and that being critiqued, which sounds awful, and it is, but it is a great learning experience as well. And a lot of what they teach is about pacing, pausing, like as much as you are presenting to people who speak your language, at the same time, I think in a lot of government presentations, the ideas that we're trying to get across are fairly complicated. And so thinking about how you stage those ideas, how you sequence them, making sure that the flow is logical and that the way you speak to them is also clear, slow, manageable. It gives you such credibility when you walk into those rooms with decision makers that you just carry yourself differently, and they listen in a different fashion than they do if you haven't practiced those presentation skills.
And that is a bit of a tough pill to swallow too. The way you carry yourself and the confidence you have in itself is something that is maybe not going to sway people one way or the other, but it's certainly going to get you in the door for people to listen to you. And when I've been trying to learn as I've been learning to present a bit better and speak more clearly and all that sort of stuff, I've been listening to like famous people and not famous people, great orators basically that speak really well, and just learning from their speaking style or presentation style. And sometimes the content, I don't want to say it doesn't matter that much, but the other things can be so distracting to people that they miss all of the content, or
Absolutely.
They don't even. And so it's almost like it's necessary but not sufficient to get your point across, to have some confidence and to be able to present well.
The being able to speak.
That's what I think. Anyway.
I would agree with you. Being able to speak to something. I mean, that's your. So if your ideas only end up in your head, they're not doing anyone any good. And if you try and translate them to an audience in a way that isn't working for your audience, then it's also not doing anyone any good. So I think also presenting is hard. Like, it's hard because it's speaking in a way that we don't naturally speak. And so it sounds weird and it feels unnatural to do pauses and to speak more slowly than you naturally would. But the more you practice it, the better you get at it. And it won't feel so unnatural. And I think even, if I may be so bold, even with like ex-president or the past President Obama, some of his speeches when he first became president or when he was running to become president, he would have these very manufactured pauses in his speeches, and it felt a bit constructed. But I really feel like that became part of who he was and how he spoke as he continued in his public career. And I mean, he's a fantastic, great orator, and I think it's just become more natural and more part of who he is as he's progressed. And I think that is true of anyone, no matter where you're at in your experience on presenting and speaking to your ideas. The more you do it, the more natural it will become. And I mean, ultimately, it's like user-centered design. You really need to think of your target audience,
Yeah.
And think about what's going to land well with them, and design things from that perspective, because that's ultimately who you're trying to convince.
Yeah. He has such a distinctive style, and I find when I listen to or watch him speak, before he even says anything of substance, I already think he sounds smart. And it's because of the way he uses his pauses.
Absolutely.
And he speaks slowly when he's focusing on telling you something. And you're like, wow, this guy has got something good to say. But if you just read a transcript, you're like, well, that introduction was pretty basic or whatever, so it makes a difference for sure. Yeah. I haven't seen a lot of those earlier speeches, so I'll check that out.
Yeah. Well, I think he learned a lot from, like the Martin Luther Kings of the world. Like if you think about how those speeches were delivered, it's like huge pause, and also cadence. Like the cadence of your voice is incredibly important. And I find even with how you end your sentences can grab someone or push them away. So just, again, as you say, listening to yourself on audio or on video is a great way of just becoming a bit more aware of what's the message that you're sending, and is it the message that you want to be sending?
Yeah. And separating, for myself, it's been separating out and it is also helpful not to just watch it, but to get other people to watch it or listen to it, especially people you trust and people that are experienced at this sort of thing. Because to parse out what's actually happening versus your perception is very important too, because I've had moments where I thought I sounded really good or really smart, and then I listen back and I'm like, whoa, that's not good at all. I've also had the opposite happen where I felt really nervous and unsure of myself when I was speaking, and I listen back and I'm like, oh, well, those pauses, they sound really good. They kind of like draw people in, and so to be able to separate how you feel about what you're presenting and what people are, but it's hard. It's hard, and it's hard to do. I find it easier to speak with a mic than in a room where I'm presenting without a mic, because I find that the context of people listening to someone with a microphone that's being projected and people are kind of like all united in that, that's very helpful. And the volume too is helpful. So if people are having side conversations, it doesn't just distract you too much. But I find a mid-sized room with like 30 to 50 people without a microphone, I find that very difficult. I would always rather have a microphone. I don't know how you feel about that.
Well,
it's a very specific public speaking question.
Whether it's from, when I was teaching in public school in Korea, I had classrooms of 50 kids and no microphone. So, do a couple of years of that and it makes you a lot better. Like my voice carries very well in a room. It might be that, or I remember as a very little kid, I must have been like 7 or 8 years old. My mother is a piano teacher, and so we were very involved in the Kipling Music Festival, which is the small town where I grew up. And I decided I wanted to recite a poem. And so my mom was my coach. And my mother's also very hard of hearing. She has a hearing defect from when she was born. So she would sit me at one end of our bungalow, and she would be at the other end of our very long bungalow. And I needed to enunciate every word perfectly so she could hear perfectly. And so I'm sure I was this little kid shouting this poem, but it was actually quite effective in terms of, even at a very young age, enunciating and projecting. And so obviously in a room of 30 to 50 people, it's preferable to have a mic just because that gives you that volume. But I can be pretty loud when I need to be to corral attention. So.
Yeah, and I guess that's what makes me nervous about it is the initial, like, hey guys, I'm speaking, to get people's attention. Whereas when you step up to a mic,
yes,
the context for this person is speaking, we are listening is baked in.
I found it's a little trick that I used in the classroom, and I still, if I'm facilitating a session, I will always have a bell or little chimes or something, because if you do a little ding in a way that resonates through the room, people just automatically drop silent and pay attention. So it's a very elegant and sophisticated way to focus attention on yourself.
That's brilliant. That's what I've been missing. I just don't have the right tools. Is the thing. Okay. Are there types of presentations or speaking engagements that you don't feel strong at, or that you don't like? Like what? Like for me, it's that kind of mid-sized room, no mic. Don't like that. Mm-hmm. What is it for you?
Well, I think it's not so much what type of speaking engagement. It's more, have I been speaking a lot lately? And if I haven't, then I feel much more intimidated. It's a practice thing. It is a practice thing. And so even though I've done a lot of presentations through my life and my career and have spoken in front of many different audiences, I haven't done very much of that at all in the last year and a half. And so even I'm happy and this is very comfortable, but I was nervous coming in here today. So, I think it is a practice, and the more you do it, the better you get at it. And the more you continue and look for those opportunities, you just keep yourself in good practice.
Mm-hmm. And this is a bit of a different thing because it is, it's kind of intimate too. And you don't have a whole lot of, like when you have a meeting with someone or lunch or whatever, there's always places to go. You can check your phone, but here we just have 2 mics. We're in this very quiet room, and, we have an hour, give or take. And I don't think people are as used to that anymore. Like that isn't a skill people have, or not skill, but practice, I guess, that people do very much anymore. It's just to sit down with someone and talk for an hour or hour and a half. I've really enjoyed doing it because it kind of gives me an excuse to get to know people and get to know them fairly well in a short amount of time. I end up learning things about guests on here that, I know some of the guests I've had on here a bit better than some of my coworkers, just because I haven't sat down and for an hour been like, so tell me about your life, even though that might be a little awkward, but do you know what I mean?
Yeah. And I actually, I guess it's not exactly a speaking engagement, but I would say, where I'm the most fallible is in a small cocktail party. Like I'm a huge introvert, and so I don't mind speaking in front of groups of people. I actually prefer one-on-one conversations like this where you can dive deep. I love that. Put me in a room of say 7 to 10 people where I have to small talk. It's horrible, and I feel that's worst case scenario, and it's probably the environment where I come across the least well. So, and so I like this kind of opportunity to really dive deep and find out more about somebody.
Me too. And as far as presenting and speaking goes, I'm very introverted as well. I have some extroverted tendencies, but and I can play that. If it's a role,
yes.
I can kind of play it.
Yes, exactly.
And you kind of pretend like you're an actor or something. You just do it. But I would much rather do a presentation or speak to a crowd and then leave, or have a room on my own, or just talk to one person, than have to. Mingling after speaking is it's really nice when people want to talk. But I and sometimes I'm excited. I have some energy after I speak, but I find it awkward.
Yes.
Connecting with people in that cocktail sort of experience you're talking about.
I find,
it's like, what do you say?
Yeah. It's hard. It's funny. You hit the nail on the head. If I am the representative, so if I'm fulfilling a role, I'm much more comfortable than if I am being myself. Like that feels very exposed. And so, I'm a very private person, and I don't know. Yeah, funnily, seeing as we're sitting here talking about myself for like hours on end, I actually don't really like talking about myself very much in my work life or my personal life, to be honest with you. So in that little cocktail party scenario, it's just like, I just find it really difficult.
I had an experience with that really quite recently. I went to the Premier's Awards back in November, and it was great. I'd never been before. It was my first time, and I was talking to someone at work, and I said, "Do you have any?" I was talking about timing because it started like pretty early, like 5:30, the reception or whatever, and the dinner wasn't until 7. And I didn't want to mingle a whole lot. I just kind of wanted to go to the dinner or come late to the reception and whatever. And so I asked my colleague, okay, well, do people actually go on time to these things, or do people just show up for the dinner or whatever? And she said to me, actually, this is a really important night for people, and it's important to show up and be on time. And so I was like, that's not the response I wanted. So anyway, I went on time. I went right on time. And I was like the first person there. And they had this like they had like a row of volunteers to like kind of receive people and take their jackets and do all this thing. And so there were like, I want to say like 20 people that were helping me find my name tag. And it was like just me. And I thought about like leaving and getting some dinner somewhere else and coming back, but I was already there and I felt awkward doing that. These people watching me do that. Like, what is this guy doing? He just came up, took his name tag and left. And so I like went in, and sure enough, there were like 2 people in this big kind of reception area kind of milling about. And I didn't know what to do because people were kind of trickling in, and I didn't know anyone there yet, and I didn't really want to meet anyone or talk to anyone. Luckily, an extrovert came up to me and introduced himself, and then I was fine.
Yeah.
Because it was just him and I was like, we can talk about trail running and our dogs and this and that and the other thing, but yeah,
it's hard.
Can be painful, those situations, for us introverts.
It's funny because I can't tell you how many times in government I've heard people say your network is your most important asset. And I think when people think about networking, they think about going to events like that and mingling, which, if that's what networking is, thanks, I'll pass. But it's interesting. I was chatting with someone about this a little while ago, and they said, I don't think of networking in that way. I really think of it as the work you do and the people you interact with in the work that you do, and the broader that you can make that's where you're actually creating your network, not by going for cocktails at some social hour. And I thought that was really good advice, because I think when you're working on something with someone, they really get to see who you are and how you are in the work that you do and how you go about that. And I think that's a much better calling card, for lack of a better term, than being able to do kind of charming small talk. But maybe I'm biased towards that because I don't do charming small talk. So
I've had someone explain networking to me in a different way as well, a different way from what I expected, but also slightly different from what it's kind of related to what you said. But I was talking to someone and I just was talking about my distaste for that networky schmoozy sort of thing. Some people do it so well, I don't know, like you can see them bounce around from person to person, and you're just like, what type of god is this person? Like, and they don't make it awkward, and it's not slimy or any, like, they're just great at talking, like work in the room. Anyway, but I had someone explain to me that networking isn't necessarily just like business cards or whatever. She said, I think about it more in terms of building relationships with people. And so when she said that, I was like, I can get on board with that, because I like building relationships with people. I do like meeting new people, one-on-one conversations, small groups of people. I love that. I eat it up. But it's those big event things, those events where there's expectations to get outside your comfort zone and meet. It's like, I don't want to get outside my comfort zone. Maybe there's a networking. It's called my comfort zone for a reason. I like it here. I'd rather read a book. Like,
Yeah, it's funny. I was at I did my undergraduate at University of Saskatchewan, and the one of my past professors is now president of the university, and he happened to be in town for an alumni event. So I went, and he was, as you described, someone who was able to work the room, not slimy at all, but just very engaging and sincere. And I just thought, yeah, that's
it's a good skill.
It's being a public personality, I think, and I suspect that maybe similar to presenting, it's something that you could practice, or I could practice and get better at. It would be lovely though to have someone like that who's really skilled at working a room to say, these are the sorts of things, like here's your entrances and your exits from conversations.
Can we agree to, after this, start petitioning PSA for a new course, Networking for Introverts?
Oh,
something
I love
like that.
Like,
that
sounds fantastic.
Yeah, I would be into that. So I do want to get back to your career here and talk a bit about when you were getting ready. Well, I don't even know if you were getting ready to leave SDPR, but kind of in the later stages of your time there, did you make a conscious decision to move to another sector, another ministry? Was it just an opportunity? Like, talk to me about that decision.
Yeah. That was a very interesting time. I have a lot of affection for SDPR. It's a great ministry. Fantastic people. Meaningful work. That's the reason why I stayed there so long. And they have a fantastic leadership culture as well. So I just found it to be a really fantastic place to work. And I probably, so I kind of had a certain idea about my career path that didn't quite come true the way that I expected. Once again, sometimes you set yourself up and then things don't work out the way you expected. And so, I was just in a situation where I wasn't loving the work anymore, and there were a few complicating, I wasn't loving the person I was reporting into, and that's a very, very important part of my work, is that I need to have a very good relationship with my supervisor. And so to me, it was clear that it was time to look for something else. Like, I'm not the kind of person who's going to stay put and be miserable and cause everyone around me to be miserable. I'd much rather just, I'm not happy, so that's on me to then find out a place where I can be happy. And so I ended up, I looked at a few different opportunities, but ended up working for CSNR, which is Corporate Services for the Natural Resource Ministries. And I think it's funny, even though I was in SDPR, I always kind of had half an eye out at Ministry of Environment. I'm fairly environmental in my leanings, and so,
So you were interested.
I was interested, yes, and so I got a job where I was working in strategic HR and serving the Ministries of Environment and, at the time, Ministry of Aboriginal Relations and Reconciliation, which is now MIR. And so two totally fascinating ministries that I was very excited about building relationships in. And so the idea in my mind was, let's make a move over here and see what doors open up and where the next opportunity might lie. And I probably spent maybe a couple of years in CSNR and did some really fun project work with some great people, and then ended up being at Climate Action Secretariat.
Yeah. So I'm curious why they do corporate services in the way that they do, those ministries. Because it's different from everyone else. Everyone else does the corporate stuff in-house.
Yes.
There's a handful that do it.
Yeah. So the
FLNRO, Environment.
So the Natural Resource Ministries are FLNRO, Environment, Agriculture, Energy Mines and Petroleum Resources, and MIR. And they're not the only ones who have that kind of corporate model, because I think there's four ministries in the economy sector that also have a pooled corporate
centralized.
Yeah, corporate services. But it is a little bit of a different model. And I think, I mean, I guess there, like anything, there's pros and cons. So, I think the good thing is that you can really scale to, as a ministry has a need, if you've got this fairly robust team, they can serve that ministry and provide more service when necessary. So you can kind of pool your resources where they're needed across those multiple ministries. But it also means that, like I was serving 2 ministries, not one, which is
you can get pulled in different directions.
Yeah. And to be honest, I didn't have as deep of a relationship or as deep a knowledge of the ministry as I did, for example, when I was working at SDPR. So yeah, I mean, as I said, pros and cons.
Yeah. And so what was that strategic HR position?
So I was working as director of strategic HR, and I think there's a lot of confusion about HR in government, generally speaking. And so just to, I always kind of think of it as a sandwich. So the PSA provides the overall corporate strategic approach to people strategies, and they also do the operational work where you're doing working with an HR advisor on hiring someone, for example. And strategic HR is in the middle. So generally speaking, they sit in ministries and they provide advice and solutions on people issues for ministry executives. So some of the things that I've worked on in strategic HR, as I mentioned earlier, the succession planning for Ministry of Environment. So leadership development programs. How do you actually groom your middle managers to be ready to take on those senior manager roles? How do you tap into an area that's got everyone who's working in this branch has 25 plus years of experience and are highly specialized. So how do you put a succession plan in place for that group? So it could be almost anything under the sun related to people. And that's kind of, it's a great area to work in because it is really, creative and also quite complex, which I've always liked.
Mm-hmm. So just, and that was the role you had just before this one,
mm-hmm.
right? So now we're just about up to speed. It only took an hour and a half. But that's my fault for all the digressions and all my overly specific examples and questions about public speaking and whatever else we've been talking about. I am curious, just as we kind of look to wrap up here, when you've moved between these different portfolios and you've taken on different pieces of work in different sectors, we already talked about presenting, and obviously a transferable skill.
Yeah.
What are the other things that are necessary to make those moves? If you're not a subject matter expert and you're not moving to another ministry that has a similar shop or whatever, what are those skills that you have that have helped you?
Definitely, I think being able to write is an important skill, and let me put a little bit of a caveat on that. And I think the simpler and plainer that you can write, the more directly you can write, the better. Anyway, one practice I usually do is anything can withstand a 10 to 20% edit. Just get rid of anything that's extraneous. So that's a key skill because as you move up, right now, a lot of even my emails, I'm sending emails to ADMs and DMs and on a somewhat regular basis. And these people have no time. So if your email can't be scanned and the key salient points pulled out in literally a 10-second scan, then you haven't done your job well. So it's learning those skills about how to really crystallize what it is that you want to say in as few words as possible. So there's that. I think project management, of course, is one, how to actually take something, break it down, and then figure out how to accomplish it. Analytical skills are huge. And even though I haven't done a lot of policy work, I think policy, being a policy analyst or doing that high-level policy work is a very transferable skill in government because every ministry has that need. And leadership, quite frankly. and we haven't talked a lot about leadership, but I think knowing how
Right, that's the whole point of this podcast. I forgot about that. Leadcast, it's in the title.
Leadcast.
Gosh, thank you, Elaine. Finally. Okay. Let's start again.
To be continued.
Yeah, exactly.
But knowing how to work with people, and I say with, not anyway. I think there's a difference between working for people versus working with people. But knowing how to build relationships and develop teams, I think, is a huge skill that government I rewards, quite frankly. Like, if you've got good leadership skills, I think it will always bode you well.
What does that look like? So building teams, working with people?
Yeah. I think of it as creating a safe space for people to do good work. So what does that look like? It means actually knowing the people that work with you, treating them with respect, knowing that everyone has great skills. So playing to people, knowing what people's strengths are and playing to those strengths, knowing them well enough to know where they want to develop and helping them to develop stretch goals. So what's some of the work that you can push towards someone so that they can develop presentation skills, for example. So it's really about fostering talent. I think is what leadership is, and empowering people to do their best and to take on increasingly difficult work and more complicated work as they move through their career.
Mm-hmm. And when I've said this before on previous episodes with other guests, but I think all those things are true. I think another thing that great leaders and supervisors have done for me is, yes, giving me some assignments that are going to push me, or just even pieces of work that maybe are not too complicated, but are from a realm that I want to get experience in, so it helps me get a foot in the door or whatever, mm-hmm. right? But also introducing me to people has been huge, and not in a networky way, but just in a, you might be able to learn something from this person, mm-hmm. or you guys might get along.
Yeah.
Here you are. That's been really helpful for me, and because that's been done for me, I try to pay that forward too with my team, and not in a passive way either, but put it to staff. I was thinking the other day that you're really skilled at this, or you're interested in this, and I have these people in my network. Mm-hmm. Can I set something up, or have one of them come give a presentation to our team, or whatever it is? Just kind of because people aren't always at every level you get to. My experience has been that you don't always have the skills or the ability to broaden your circle of knowledge or network on your own. Some people can, and they hit the ground running and just, but I think most people who have been successful have had some help mm-hmm. with that at every stage, you know?
Yeah.
So that's another thing.
Yeah, I think also, I think of it as lending my perspective. It's not so when I'm having conversations with people I'm working with, it's not so much do it this way. It's more, have you considered this? Or that's interesting. I would have looked at it this way, but I can see so it's a conversation where you're providing your perspective, which is a little bit different than theirs, and there's instances where the buck stops and this needs to be done in a certain way. But I think the more that someone owns their work, and at me as a leader, I'm providing clarity of expectations. I'm providing hopefully that people are actually going in the same direction to achieve a tangible goal that's been articulated. But then their pieces really sit with them, and mm-hmm. I'm an ally in that journey. I'm not a conductor, if that makes sense.
Big time. And one thing, one piece of advice that I don't really love giving or receiving advice, because advice is so specific to what has made one person successful in a given circumstance doesn't necessarily work for other people or anyone in any circumstance, right? So it's hard to generalize. But one thing that I was taught to do was, this is my view on something. What are your thoughts? And so I sign off so many of my emails with that now when people are asking me for this or that, or, if it's approval or if it's my view on something or whatever, like I always ask for, it's a conversation, like you said. This is what I think. What are your thoughts? And kind of goes back and forth. And and there are exceptions where you do need to provide a sort of not a fulsome answer that is a response, but those are often the exception, not.
I would agree.
Yeah, the rule.
Yeah.
Well, is there anything else you'd like to say? I feel like the time flew by.
It really did. Yeah. I wasn't sure. It's like, oh man, an hour and odds chit-chatting, but it's been a good conversation. Thank you for the opportunity.
Yeah, of course. Was it? I want to ask you about your expectations about this experience. What did you expect, and what was it for you? I'm doing a live
evaluation
survey.
Good.
Yeah.
That's good. Well, I think my expectation, I don't know, like I try not to, I had really good advice from someone because I tend to be very analytical and tend to overthink things. So I've been really in the last few years trying to step back from that. So not like playing things in my mind ahead of time. So it's like, we had a conversation about what this would be like. And I think I tried to come in with zero or not low expectations in terms of how I thought.
Thank you for that. No, just kidding.
But just not having
preconceived notions.
Preconceived notions, exactly. And I think it's actually been very delightful. So.
Yeah, it was good for me. I enjoyed it. I was talking to my partner the other day, and she knows that I do this, and I kind of brief her on what's going on, and at a very high level about work stuff, and we talk about our days and stuff. And so I was referred to you through someone, and so I didn't actually know you before we emailed, and we had a conversation. And so I was saying to my partner, I was like, I had this conversation with Elaine, and we're going to do a podcast. But I was like, I'm very in my head too. And so, and she's like, oh, well, how was it? And I said, I don't know how the phone call went. I don't know. I don't think I was, I don't think I pitched it very well. We kind of talked over each other. I don't know if we had any chemistry. And I was being really hard on myself. And, but I've really enjoyed this conversation. I don't mean to sound so surprised, but it's been good, and it's been it's been intellectually stimulating. I found anyway. So I really do appreciate you coming in and spending the time.
Yeah, no, my pleasure, and I have also enjoyed it. And I think as someone who has always had a tendency to beat herself up, again, it's one of those things where I'm trying to step back from that, but it's. You have good days and you have days when it's not so good in terms of like just being your own worst critic. So, I live in that space as well. I know what that is like. Yeah.
Okay, well, let's try to not be so hard on ourselves.
Deal. Let's make a mutual commitment. We'll be like pilots for the Networking for Introverts and the Don't Beat Yourself Up Club.
Yeah, I think we've got a couple of good projects coming up, you and I. So this will be good. Thanks so much for coming in, and I'll talk to you soon.
Sounds good. Thanks, Jonathan.
Okay. That was my conversation with Elaine. It was funny. It was intellectually stimulating for me. I mean, I won't speak for you, of course, whoever you are, but man, I did enjoy talking to her. Something else I've enjoyed is is this whole process of doing LeadCast, and we're wrapping up season 1 now. That's it. We're going to take a bit of a break, but I'm really excited for the content we have lined up for when we come back. After a break, I feel like I'm a talk show host. We're going to take a break. We'll be right back. But that is true. We are going to take a break, and we will be right back. So hang tight. I'll talk to you soon.